2.5 Admins, episode 182. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. Nginx has been forked to free Nginx.
Yeah, so this is a post by Maxime Dunin, who's one of the major contributors to Nginx. This has been for a long time. And on the mailing list, he posts, as you probably know, F5 acquired Nginx a couple of years ago, and back in 2022, closed the Moscow office, and I no longer work for F5. Still, we'd reached an agreement that he would maintain his role as an Nginx developer as a volunteer. And for most of the 2 years, he worked on improving Nginx and making it better for everyone for free. Unfortunately, some new non-technical management at F5 recently decided they know better how to run an open source project. In particular, they decided to interfere with the security policy that Nginx has used for years, ignoring the policy in all the developers' position. That's quite understandable. They own the project and can do anything they want with it, including making marketing-motivated decisions, ignoring developer positions, and ignoring the community. Still, this contradicts our agreement, and more importantly, I no longer am able to control which changes are made to Nginx within F5, and no longer see Nginx as a free and open source project developed and maintained for the public good. As such, starting from today, I will no longer participate in Nginx development as run by F5. Instead, I'm starting an alternative project, which is going to be run by developers and not corporate entities, freenginx.org. The goal is to keep Nginx development free from arbitrary corporate actions. Please help and contribute, and that'll be welcome, and hope this will benefit everyone.
So essentially, company buys open source project, pisses off major developers of said open source project forks. It is not the first time this has happened, and it will not be the last. The most obvious, relatively recent example of this happening would be the MariaDB fork from MySQL. Usually when these forks happen, the fork ends up picking up the momentum. Now, MySQL and MariaDB was one example of that not going down that way. I, along with most of the world, expected everybody to pick up MariaDB and for MySQL to end up being basically the database equivalent of OpenOffice, forgotten in everything but name once the fork happened, but it didn't end up that way. I still see more MySQL in most places than MariaDB.
I see about 50-50 between those two, although now that they've started to introduce incompatibilities between the two, I've started to see some people having to pull back to plain MySQL. In particular, there's like one query that some applications have started using dealing with the default when you do a group by, and it's causing problems in people having to switch from what was a completely compatible replacement to one that's not. Whereas MariaDB had a bunch of advantages, especially like the fact that they integrate the Galera cluster patches and so on, versus with Oracle MySQL, you have to go and get a patched copy of it from the Galera people instead of it being, available as a package.
I guess the point here is really that we don't know which way things are going to go. We've seen it happen both ways. Sometimes you have an ideological fork caused by developers disagreeing with the parent company that bought a project, and the entire world immediately goes with the developers. Sometimes it goes the other way. If F5 can do a good enough job at being stewards of the Nginx project without Maxime, they can probably keep it based on name recognition. On the other hand, if they don't do a good enough job, well, we've all seen what happened with LibreOffice versus OpenOffice, despite the much better branding on the older name.
Well, the other thing will also be, I don't know how many people used like Nginx Pro or the paid versions of Nginx and are getting support subscriptions and so on. I think the other interesting thing here is looking at the why. It's not just that they were making decisions they didn't like, it was specifically they appear to be interfering with the long-established security policy of Nginx, which I think is how to deal with incoming vulnerability reports and how quickly they get stuff out. I don't know exactly what the problem is, and it's not public, it seems, at this time. But if, for example, they were deciding that people that pay for Nginx Pro get security advisories months in advance of other people or something, I can see why that would make the developers decide that a fork makes sense. It will, I think, partly come down to how many other Nginx developers join Maxime. While he is a very large portion of all Nginx development, it will really depend, where the bulk of the momentum ends up.
The thing that makes me a little bit less Team Maxime this time, and to be clear, I don't think that I or any of us really know enough of the details to make hard and fast judgments here. But I'm a little bit less automatically Team Maxime than I would normally expect to be, because when we look at some of the details that he has released on the mailing list, somebody asked for details about how the security policy was violated or changed, and Maxime replies, the most recent security advisory, which he puts in scare quotes, was released despite the fact that the particular bug in the experimental HTTP3 code is expected to be fixed as a normal bug as per the existing security policy, and all the developers, including me, agree on this. So basically, he's upset that the new management issued a security advisory on something that he didn't think was a bad enough bug to warrant it. And I'm a lot more sympathetic when the issue is the other way around, when company management says, no, you can't issue a security advisory and the devs wanted to.
Yeah, although part of it might be kind of a lost in the details there is he's talking about this is a fix that we should just fix and make public right away versus this is a security fix that we should hold on to and have a coordinated release. And so if it's, we have a fix, but we're not going to release it right now, that's a motivation that makes maybe a bit more sense than I think they're making a big deal out of something that's not.
That would make more sense.
It would.
And I understand maybe from F5's side that we want to make sure that our especially paying customers have time to deploy this patch before we release all the details to the public.
That would make more sense. I wish we had more concrete information.
Yes. We are speculating off mailing list posts by somebody where English is not their first language.
Very true. Very true. And, personally, as an Apache user, I'm just patting myself on the back that I don't have to care about it too much.
VMware kills the free version of ESXi.
Say it with me, folks. First you attract, then you extract. So this is obviously a long-term own goal for VMware. And notice I say VMware specifically, not Broadcom. Broadcom purchased VMware, and Broadcom has made the decision to kill off ESXi because presumably, the only reason to do so is because you see it as a channel that people are able to use your services for free and you want to get money out of them. The problem is, for VMware, it's an own goal because without ESXi, you're not getting a legion of people who learn on the free version as hobbyists and then want to take that knowledge to work where work spins the bucks. If you don't get the foothold in with the hobbyists to begin with, well, they're not going to advocate for your product once they're where all the money is. So in the long term, this is an own goal.
Yeah, it'd be like killing off CentOS and just killing off your stream of people who are going to ultimately buy RHEL.
Yeah, it would be a lot like that, only it would be even worse because you could make an argument that at least Fedora is still somewhat of a pipeline into proper Red Hat.
Yeah, or CentOS Stream even.
Yeah, or CentOS Stream, but with VMware, there's just, once you kill off ESXi, you've killed off everything that isn't hugely expensive. So it raises the question, where will your new generation of engineers who are going to use this technology learn it? Because they're not going to do it in home labs. It's pretty unlikely that they're going to learn it specifically, in university, especially when there are so many free hypervisors available to teach the basic concepts on. So in my opinion, this looks like the death knell for vSphere. I think they're entering that, Oracle long-term game where they're like, well, we've clearly already pissed off everybody in the smaller segment. Nobody new is going to adopt us. So at this point, it's about extracting everything out of the little folks on their way out and just making sure we continue to be as entrenched and locked in as possible at enterprises that have enough money that they'll just sigh and keep paying us because they don't want to change their infra.
Yeah, it's been very interesting, especially to see the VMware partners, especially companies that make an appliance or something that currently use VMware, and see the cost per unit for them going from like $800 to $5,000. And if you're making a kind of lower end of the market appliance, that's basically takes you out of contention for that segment of the market, just that extra licensing cost. And so there's a whole bunch of smaller appliance type companies that are now looking at, can we migrate away from VMware for our tech stack?
Presumably this is good news for Proxmox.
It's good news for everybody that's not VMware. It's good news for KVM. It's good news for Parallels. It's good news for Proxmox. God, it's good news for Hyper-V users. Bless their little hearts. Again, this is a huge own goal from VMware's perspective because essentially, they just heard their own funeral rites. But from Broadcom's perspective, well, Broadcom doesn't really care. Broadcom bought VMware and bought it to make money out of it. And they are extracting the value now. And when they're done, it's going to be a husk, and that's just how it works.
Yeah, VMware's had quite a history and was a big innovator for a long time, but they've been through a lot over the last decade.
OpenZFS native encryption use raises data corruption concerns. This is a piece in Phoronix, and we talked about this not that long ago. This is just this same old bug that no one can report with enough detail for you guys to fix it, right?
Basically.
There's probably more than one bug. At least there's more than one bug report being tracked. Unfortunately, these are difficult to hit issues, which doesn't mean that they're not issues or shouldn't be fixed. So I'm glad that Phoronix, pushed it out and is bringing more awareness to it. Because the last thing that I want is to, go down the butter route of just pretending that, everything's fine and we don't have any bugs and everything's great. As it stands, we're looking mostly, especially with, what Phoronix is raising, hard to hit bugs that involve ZFS native encryption and replication of snapshots. And for the most part, the bugs aren't the nightmare, world over scenario for full disk encryption where you're just like, I don't have access to any of my data anymore. It's usually more along the lines of I replicated and things looked really weird on the target and I had to reboot it and scrub it and then it looks fine, okay, I guess. Now, again, this is not the kind of feelings that I personally want to have about the ultimate file system, which is why I'm glad that we are getting more public attention raised on the issue. With that said, I don't think anybody should chicken little over it and say, oh no, ZFS is dead or ZFS is, more buggy than other file systems, because that is definitely not the case. I've really never lost any data with ZFS, which is the only file system I can say that for, because ZFS gives me the tools to make sure that the data is available in enough places that when there are problems of one kind or another, I can recover.
Yeah, so if you see anything weird with ZFS, especially when you're doing replication with encryption, and then on the backup side, you get messages about bad blocks or just something weird with the snapshot, or especially a damaged snapshot, we would love to get details. So far, most of the bug reports are like, something didn't work, but I already replaced the data or something, so we have no way to actually look and see what happened, or I don't know what I was doing on the system. And we just have a couple of vague error messages. And while there's a lot of interest in getting these fixed, that requires some information to maybe be able to get to a reproduction case where if we can make this happen on cue by purposely replicating a certain snapshot or purposely causing something to happen, then we can really dig into it, get a resolution and get it fixed and get that fix backported to all the old versions and solved for everybody. But while it's still just 1 in a million times something weird happens, it is very difficult to be able to investigate the bug.
You're looking for good quality bug reports with follow-up.
Yeah.
Who isn't?
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Kolide. What do you call an endpoint security product that works perfectly but makes users miserable? A failure. The old approach to endpoint security is to lock down employee devices and roll out changes through forced restarts, but it just doesn't work. IT is miserable because they've got a mountain of support tickets, employees start using personal devices to get their work done, and executives opt out the first time it makes them late for a meeting. You can't have a successful security implementation unless you work with end users. That's where Kolide comes in. Their user-first device trust solution notifies users as soon as it detects an issue on their device and teaches them how to solve it without needing help from IT. That way, untrusted devices are blocked from authenticating, but users don't stay blocked. Kolide is designed for companies with Okta, and it works on macOS, Windows, Linux, and mobile devices. So if you have Okta and you're looking for a device trust solution that respects your team, support the show and go to kolide.com/25A to watch a demo and see how it works. That's KOLIDE.com/25A. Fast dedup is a Valentine's gift to the OpenZFS and TrueNAS communities. This is IX Systems and your company, Clara, have worked on solving one of the long-standing problems with ZFS, it seems.
Yeah, so OpenZFS has had dedup since, I think, 2010 or earlier. Almost as long as it's been in FreeBSD, that's had dedup. But it turns out that dedup had quite a few problems. Firstly, the more data you dedupe, the slower it got every time you tried to write some data. It never really affected read, but it really made writes get slower and slower and slower. With the stock one, when we were testing, we'd see a machine that can do testing on one SSD that can do 500 megabytes a second, and it would do that. But as the dedupe table got bigger, we get down to like 30 megabytes a second with only a couple hundred gigs of data written out, and the performance would just keep going down and down and down until completely unusable. Other problems you could have is if that whole DDT wouldn't fit in memory, then certain things like even trying to do a rewind on the pool during a crash recovery could mean it would take days because it would be like read part of the DDT and do some stuff and then have to free that memory and load up a different part of the DDT, and just kind of basically swapping in and out all the time means it would take days to complete when, your system's offline. And it's like, okay, you can import the pool if you install more RAM, but, maybe your motherboard physically doesn't hold more RAM than you've already put in your ZFS server.
And to be clear, the performance issues, those occur even when the entire DDT fits in RAM just fine. Mm-hmm. The only time I attempted to use dedupe in production, I had massively more RAM than required for ARC and DDT and everything else for the amount of data that I had. I had a 128 gig server with less than 4 terabytes of data on it. And nevertheless, after a couple of 3 years, a Rust pool that had been capable of about 300 or 400 megabytes per second of throughput was incapable of delivering more than about 5 megabytes per second write. With the entire DDT and RAM, like everything in as good condition as it could possibly be, and then I turned off dedupe on that server, and the writes immediately shot right back up to several hundred megabytes a second again.
And so the advice has been, don't enable dedupe on any ZFS server.
Correct.
Mine certainly has been. The canonical advice was always be very cautious about dedupe, and here are these list of very unusual scenarios in which dedupe might actually be a win for you. Hey, maybe it'll even be a performance win if you have, this or that, or a ratio of over this many to that, many of dedupe data. But in my experience, no, I don't know how far out on the edge you'd need to be to find a case that would suit the original ZFS dedupe, but I ain't found it and I can't imagine it.
To be clear, that was lowercase canonical, not uppercase Ubuntu canonical.
Yes, the word, not the brand.
Yeah, and in the collective experience of both IX and Clara, we've never found somebody who is actually happy with using it. Everybody basically regrets turning it on when they do turn it on. Even people who built a specific pool for it, and it was just like, even with all NVMe, the performance still got terrible. And a big part of that was the amplification effect, especially if you're thinking like, I'm going to have a database with lots of the same rows or something. So small blocks and lots of them being the same. It turns out that when you write one new block to ZFS while dedupe is on, first, you might have to read somewhere between 1 to 5 blocks to see if you already have the block that you just tried to write. Then, you didn't, or even if you did, now we have to update the dedupe table to say either here's the new block that we just learned about, or hey, that block we already have, we need another copy of it. Both of those now have to write to that dedupe table, which sure, maybe there's a copy in memory, but we need a copy on disk for after we reboot. And so that write may also take 1 to 5 IOPS, because you have to write the block and its neighbors, and then the indirect blocks, the whole copy on write tree all the way up to the top. And so if you have an SSD that could do, 100,000 IOPS, but in general, you're taking somewhere between 5 to 20x as many IOPS as you actually use to just keep the dedupe table up between the reads and writes, then suddenly, your 100,000 IOPS is 5,000 IOPS, and you're like, what happened to my pool?
Not only that, it's not like your 20,000 IOPS became 5,000 or your 100,000 became 5,000. It's not just that, because you might look at, a Rust drive and say, well, this thing's only capable of 200 IOPS, and it's more than sufficient in, lots of scenarios. But the thing is, the hard drive is still only issuing a single operation each time, out of that 200 IOP pool. When we talk about, an IOPS amplification on the drives when we've got dedupe going on and you have to issue 5 IOPS to do a single operation, you're not issuing them in parallel. You're waiting for each one to come back. So you're massively increasing the latency per operation in addition to, starving the overall amount of IOPS per, that you've got available.
Yeah, especially when you have to do reads before you can do a write, because you can't even batch those. And they are, like Jim said, each independent. Like when you have to look up the indirect block to see where the other block even is. So you can't issue that write until you get the answer, because the answer is going to tell you the address to go find the next block. And so it's really bad. So what Clara designed and developed for this is what we call fast dedupe, which part of that involves a log. So when we have to make those updates to the dedupe table, instead of writing them out with each transaction group in a way that means the transaction can't finish until we've made all these updates, we use an append-only log that allows us to log the updates and then do bulk updates to the dedupe table after the fact, kind of out of band, and it makes the performance hit a lot lower.
And by a lot, you mean a hell of a lot.
Yeah, the two biggest things are that the performance drop isn't as bad. You know, you're not dropping from 500 megabytes to 30. You're dropping from like 500 to 400 maybe. And it doesn't linearly go down the bigger the dedupe table gets, because you're always just appending to the log. Your performance is going to stay relatively steady and not get worse and worse and worse as the pool fills up.
So this is going to be usable, but it is still early days with this.
Yes, this is still early beta, but the pull requests are now open. The code is out there and it's going to go through review. And we expect probably late next month that there will be like images of TrueNAS you can download to give this a spin.
But the bad news for Ubuntu LTS users is we're not going to get this for 2 years effectively.
You're right. This is going to be, the target is just to come out as part of OpenZFS 2.3, which will come out later this year. And so that, you know, Ubuntu's already picked the version of ZFS they're shipping, and that's not going to change.
For 2404, which is coming out in April, so it's effectively 2026 when we'll get this in production, if you stick to LTSs.
Well, you can also just replace the ZFS package on your Ubuntu with a different one.
Which is a great idea, isn't it, Jim?
It is not a great idea. I've been wincing this whole time because I keep waiting for somebody, anybody, please to be the voice of reason and say, it's not a terrible thing to wait until 2026 to play with this feature because it's on your file system. And it would be great if thousands of people had time to test it widely before you committed yourself to it.
Well, kind of particularly that goal, one thing that the ZFS community and Clara have been talking about is making a semi-official repo where you could update the version of ZFS that's in your Ubuntu machine to 2.2 while you're still on Ubuntu 2204, or even 2.3 when you're on 2404, with, you know, reliable updates coming from upstream that are going to be compatible with Ubuntu kernel. Partly also so that we can do the same snapshots of the main branch of ZFS, so that when we have a new feature like this, people can easily test it instead of needing to be a ZFS developer to know how to build and install ZFS to be able to try it out, even in a VM.
That would be great. And if you had such a repository available, I would absolutely be using it on my home workstation and not be using it on my production servers. And that would be great. I would like that a lot.
Yep. Well, it's a work in progress right now.
So what kind of performance delta are we expecting if you enable the new fast dedupe versus not having it on?
That really, really depends on workload, especially your record size and what your pool looks like, and if you have a dedicated dedupe VDEV or not. But definitely at least 10 times not as bad as classic dedupe.
Put that on the poster. 10 times not as bad.
At least 10 times not as bad. Boy, that's just got a ring to it, Alan. You got a future in marketing.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And you even get some episodes early. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Another perk of being a patron is you get to skip the queue, which is what Philip has done. He writes, I want to set up a NAS as a backup server for my other machines. Ideally, I'd like to connect the NAS with a cable, but it would have to run the whole length of my flat, and I'd prefer to avoid that. Most of the traffic is between my NAS and my desktop, so would it make sense to connect the NAS by Wi-Fi generally, but give it a wired connection direct to the desktop as well?
So what we've got here is essentially his whole network is Wi-Fi right now. and he would like for the communication between the NAS and the desktop machine to be wired. Now, in order to do that, yes, it absolutely makes sense to go ahead and put that NAS right next to the desktop. The desktop presumably already has a wired interface that you're just not using. So you'll set that up as a point-to-point link. You won't actually have a router or a switch or anything. You just run a cable directly in between the NAS and the desktop, and you give each one an IP address on the same subnet, which is different from your normal network subnet. So basically, these IP addresses, they only exist as far as the NAS and the desktop themselves are concerned. Now, for the rest of the machines to be able to access the NAS also has to be able to get to the major network, which is currently happening over Wi-Fi. Now, you could do some complicated stuff, and you could set up routing on the desktop machine so that it would route between the wired connection to the NAS and the Wi-Fi for the rest of the network, but that's probably not going to be the best bet, especially because Philip went on to say that he's looking at buying a Synology DNS 923+. Now, that Synology model has 2 Ethernet interfaces on it, so yeah, he can just configure one interface to hook up to what we used to call a game controller, which is just a bridge from wired Ethernet to Wi-Fi. And you may want to search game controller when you look for those now. I haven't had to buy one in a very long time, but the last time I bought them, you could get a wired to Wi-Fi bridge for about $300, or you could get a game controller, which was the exact same hardware but in fun Mountain Dew colors, for about $50. So that might be something to be aware of.
There are also some where they're called like a pocket router. They're a little USB powered thing, and it's got Wi-Fi and an Ethernet port. I have a couple of them that were about $25 or $35.
Those are usually a little bit more work to set up because they are intended to be like a router, like something portable you might use in a hotel room. So there tends to be some more cruft on the front, more capabilities that you have to know whether you're using that or not using that and how to deal with it. Whereas the simpler bridge or game controller is, literally just you tell it what Wi-Fi network to join, and it just joins that Wi-Fi network, and it passes everything down to the wired interface, and that's it. So it tends to be a whole lot easier to deal with.
Yeah, I've also used one in the past, specifically in that mode, for a laptop where there wasn't an open source driver for the Wi-Fi card. So plug in the Ethernet and use the little dongle to connect to the Wi-Fi.
Was that running FreeBSD by any chance, Alan?
At the time, yes, with the brand new Intel driver that wasn't supported in Linux yet either.
Yeah, I'm sure it wasn't.
Another thing to look for any of the other handful of people who have Philip's same problem, if you haven't selected a NAS model yet and you're still shopping, but you want a similar setup, you want 2 separate interfaces in order to get to your NAS, be aware that some NASs have built-in Wi-Fi as well as wired interfaces. You can shop for that. Also, it's not that uncommon to find a NAS with a USB port, and most of those NASs with USB ports will accept a USB NIC, whether it's wired or Wi-Fi. Now, you can't just assume because I saw a USB NIC will work. You'll need to research more carefully than that, but that is a thing, so it's a thing you can look for.
Another couple options if people are in the similar situation, if your desktop does have a wired connection that was maybe built into the wall or something, but you can't get a second one, another thing you can do is buy a small switch, like a little TP-Link 5-port switch, and take the one feed you have to your desktop, plug that in there, and then plug both the desktop and the NAS into that. And that means when the traffic is between your desktop and the NAS, it'll go in that little switch and otherwise route out to the router. And that's how I managed to connect a couple machines in my office here, even though there's only one Ethernet drop in the room.
Exactly how I do it as well, yeah. I've got a TP-Link switch in here. It's actually a 16-port that someone gave me. Yeah,
I use little desktop switches as the equivalent of power strips for network all the time. I only got one port in the wall, need to connect 2 machines, drop in a $25 switch and call it a day.
The crazy thing I built in college was knowing that 100 megabit Ethernet only used half the pairs. I built this little cable, you plugged it into the wall jack on both ends, and it gave you like a Y splitter, and you got 2 separate 100 megabit connections out of the other end. It was kind of a goofy way to do it, and was not useful once everybody's NICs were gigabit instead.
Also rather prone to crosstalk if you had a lot of saturation on both sides of that split inside the same cable.
Yep.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
I'm at jrs-s.net/social.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.